My wife called me at 3:40 in the afternoon, and the first thing she said was, "Tonight you can come to dinner with my brother's fiance's family, but keep your mouth shut." I was in the garage when she called, sharpening a chisel. I put it down. I said, "That's a nice invitation." She didn't hear the joke, or she chose not to. She said, "I mean it, Harlan. This is important for Trevor. Her father is a very important man, and I need you to just sit there and be pleasant and not—" She paused, and I could hear her choosing the kindest version of the unkind thing, "not embarrass us like you always do." Like you always do. I'm 72 years old, and my wife of 7 years told me, at 3:40 on a Saturday afternoon, that I embarrass her like I always do, and asked me to sit at a dinner table all evening and not speak. And here is the thing you need to know about me before any of the rest of this makes sense. I did not argue. I did not remind her of anything. I just said, "Got it," and I meant it, and I hung up the phone, and I went back to sharpening my chisel, and that evening I put on the one good jacket I own, and I went to dinner, and I kept my mouth shut, exactly as instructed. Her brother's fiancée is named Vivian, and Vivian's family has money, real money, the kind that owns the room before anyone speaks. The dinner was at their house, which had a foyer bigger than my first apartment. There were maybe 30 people. There was a bar with a man behind it. My wife introduced me exactly twice, both times as my husband, Harlan, he's retired. And both times she said it in a way that closed the subject, and then she steered me toward a chair near the wall and gave me a look that said, "That's your spot," and I sat in it, and I kept my mouth shut. Vivian's father is a judge. That's the important man. A sitting judge, distinguished, silver-haired, the sort of man a room arranges itself around without being told to. He worked that party like a man who'd worked 1,000 of them. A hand on a shoulder here, a low laugh there, and everyone wanted a moment with him, and I sat in my chair by the wall and watched him the way you watch weather. And then it was time for the toast. He stood up with a glass, this judge, and he made his way slowly around the room as he talked, the way a certain kind of powerful man does, stopping in front of people, blessing them one at a time with his attention. He toasted his daughter. He toasted my wife's brother. The room was warm and golden and a little drunk and completely his. And then he came around the end of the long table, still talking, still smiling, and he stopped. In front of me. And his smile, I watched it happen, his smile went out. Not into anger, into something else. Into shock, and then into something that looked almost like fear, and then into something I did not expect at all, which I'll tell you about because it changed my life. The whole room was watching him now, because he'd stopped mid-sentence, and a room notices when the most important man in it stops mid-sentence and stares at the old man in the chair by the wall. He said quietly, "Hello," and then he said, "I'm very surprised to see you here." And my wife across the room went pale, because she told me later she thought, that I had finally done it. Embarrassed her so profoundly that a judge had stopped a party to address it. And then Judge Nathaniel Cross looked around at all 30 of those people, at my wife, at her brother, at Vivian, at the man behind the bar, and he looked back at me, and he asked the question that made the entire room go dead silent. "Do they know who you really are?" Now, I'm going to stop, right there, with the room silent and the judge waiting, because I know what you think is coming, and it's close, but it's not the thing that matters. You think this is a story about an old man who got underestimated and turned out to be secretly important, and that you're going to get the pleasure of watching a snobbish wife eat her words. And you'll get some of that. I won't pretend I didn't feel something standing in that room. I'm not a saint. But if that's all you take from this, you'll have missed the part that actually kept me up the last 2 weeks, the part I most need you to hear. Because the thing my wife told me to do that afternoon was to keep my mouth shut. And I spent my entire life, my entire working life, the whole thing, that this judge was about to stand in a rich man's dining room and tell 30 strangers about. I spent all of it learning to do the exact opposite. Learning to open my mouth in rooms that badly wanted me to keep it closed. Learning that the whole job, the only job that ever mattered, was to say the true thing out loud when every powerful person present was willing me to stay silent. My wife was ashamed of the one quality that was the best thing about me. She just didn't know it was there, because I'd stopped showing it to her, because I'd let her make me small to keep the peace. That's the story, not the reveal. The years of silence I agreed to before it. So, here's the one thing I'll ask you before I tell you the rest. If you have ever made yourself smaller to keep somebody comfortable, If you have swallowed the truest, best thing about yourself over and over at dinner after dinner, because saying it would cost you a fight you were too tired to have, then subscribe and stay with me. Because this is a story about what happens when a man who spent his life speaking finally has his voice given back to him by a stranger, in the last place on earth he expected it. I make these for the people who've gone quiet. Stay, and I'll show you what your voice is still worth. All right, let me tell you who I am, since the judge asked. My name is Harlan Reeves. I'm 72 years old. For 33 years I was a judge. I started as a trial judge in 1985, and I heard every kind of case a person can hear, divorces and murders and men suing each other over fence lines. And in 2005 I was appointed to this state's highest court, and for the last 9 years before I retired in 2018, I was the Chief Justice of it. Let me tell you what that means and what it doesn't, because most people get it exactly backwards. It does not mean I am rich. Judges aren't. I made a decent living and I saved it carefully, and I have enough, and I drive an 11-year-old car, and I sharpen my own chisels because I like to, and none of that is false modesty, it's just the truth of the life. And it does not mean I walk into rooms announcing myself. That's the part my wife could never understand. I spent 33 years being the most powerful person in every room I entered. A judge is. That's the design. The whole room stands when you come in. And the thing that does to a person, if he's paying attention, is it makes him never, ever want to trade on it outside that room. Because I saw every single day what people become when they think their title makes them better than the person across from them. I watched it ruin men. And I promised myself I would never be one of them, that when I took the robe off, I'd be just a man, a plain one, and I'd let people find out who I was only if they needed to. Which meant that for 7 years, my own wife mostly forgot. I need to tell you about Miriam because you can't understand my marriage to Diane without her. Miriam was my first wife. We were married for 38 years. She died in 2015, of a slow thing that gave us time to say everything, which people tell you is a mercy, and it is also its own particular cruelty to watch the person leave that slowly. Miriam knew exactly who I was. Not the title. She couldn't have cared less about the title. She knew the man, and here's the difference, and it's everything. Miriam was the person I came home to and told the truth about the hard days, the days I'd had to do something legally correct and humanly terrible, the days I'd sentenced a young man I felt sorry for because the law left me no room, the days powerful people leaned on me and I had to decide, alone, whether I was the kind of judge who could be leaned on. Miriam heard all of it. For 38 years, I was never once silent in that house, because there was a person in it who wanted the whole of me, the doubts and the weight and the parts that didn't fit on a plaque. When she died, I thought that was the end of being known. I was 61. I figured I'd finish out quiet and alone, and that would be that. And then, 3 years after I retired, I met Diane. I want to be fair to Diane because it would be easy to make her a villain. And she isn't one, she's a frightened person, and I understood her fear because I'd spent 33 years watching frightened people and I married her anyway, with my eyes open, so a good deal of this is mine. Diane grew up with nothing and spent her whole life terrified of being seen to have nothing. That's the engine of her. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Everything she does, the right handbag, the right restaurant, the right people, the anxious management of appearances, all of it is a 65-year-old woman still running from a childhood where the family's shame was public. I know that story. I sentenced 100 people whose whole lives were that story pointed in a worse direction. So Diane married me, a widowed retired judge, and I think in the beginning she was proud of it. My husband was a judge, has a nice sound at a luncheon, but a title is a thing you can say once. It fades. And what she was left with, day to day, was not a distinguished figure who dropped names and worked rooms and made her feel important by association. What she was left with was a plain old man who drives an old car and sharpens chisels and, worst of all, in her eyes, refuses to perform. Because that's the thing I would not do, the thing that became the whole fault line of our marriage. I would not trade on who I'd been. I wouldn't drop the fact that I'd been Chief Justice into conversations to impress people. I wouldn't let her introduce me that way. I'd asked her, early on, please, just say I'm retired. I treated the man parking the cars exactly the way I treated the man hosting the party, because 33 years on a bench teaches you that those two men are precisely equal in every way that will matter in the end. and I could not switch that off to make my wife look good at a party. And to Diane, all of that didn't read as principle. It read as failure to try. It read as embarrassment. Let me give you the specifics because she was ashamed of me is too clean, and the truth was made of small things, the way these things always are. At a dinner party a year into our marriage, I mentioned, when someone asked, that I'd worked in the courts. A man across the table got interested and asked what kind of law, and I said I'd been a judge. And before I could say another word, Diane laughed a little too brightly and said, "Oh, don't get him started. He'll bore you all night," and changed the subject. And I let her. I sat there and let my wife tell a table full of strangers that my life's work was boring, and I kept my mouth shut because it wasn't worth the ride home. That was the pattern, and it set that first year, and it never broke. Anytime the conversation drifted toward anything real, anything about the law, about justice, about the things I'd actually spent my life thinking hardest about, Diane would head it off. "Harlan, nobody wants a lecture." "Harlan, let it go." "Harlan, you're doing the thing." The thing being, having a thought and saying it out loud. And here's the part I'm ashamed of, and I'm telling it because the shame is the point. I let it work. I went quiet. Slowly, over 7 years, in the exact way I'd watched 100 beaten-down people go quiet in my courtroom. I stopped offering opinions at dinners. I stopped correcting things I knew were wrong when they were said confidently by people who didn't know they were wrong. I learned to sit in the chair by the wall. A man who had spent 33 years as the voice that a silent room turned to hear. I trained myself for the comfort of a frightened woman to make no sound. Why? You're allowed to ask. My children ask. My friends from the court, the few I still see, ask, less politely. Because I was lonely, and she was there. Because at 70 you do the math on how many dinners you have left, and a quiet one beside someone is warmer than an eloquent one alone. Because I genuinely loved her, love her, in the worn-in way you love a person whose fears you understand. And because, this is the real one, the one I don't like, because after Miriam died, I had lost the person who wanted my voice, and some part of me decided that maybe the voice wasn't worth wanting anymore. That maybe Diane was right. That maybe a retired old man opening his mouth at a dinner party really is just an embarrassment, and the dignified thing, the humble thing, is to sit down and be quiet and let the evening pass. There was one night, maybe 3 years in, that I think about now as the low point, though I didn't know it then. We were at a dinner, and a man was holding forth, confidently and completely wrongly, about a famous court case, getting the facts wrong, getting the ruling wrong, getting the whole meaning of it backwards. And it was a case I happened to know more about than almost any living person, because I had written about it, because it was in my field, because it was the kind of thing I'd given my life to, and I opened my mouth to gently correct him. Just gently. And under the table, my wife put her hand on my knee and squeezed, hard, the signal, and gave me the look. And I closed my mouth. And I let a table full of people walk away believing something false about the thing I knew best in the world, because my wife would rather they be wrong than have her husband be the man who knew. I have thought about that night a great deal. Not because it was the worst thing she did, it was small, they were all small, but because that was the night I felt something go out in me, quietly, like a pilot light. That was the night some part of me concluded that my knowing things, my having a voice, was a liability in my own marriage, a thing to be managed and suppressed, and I began from that night to volunteer less and less, until I volunteered nothing, until I was the silent old man in the chair, which is exactly what she'd trained me toward, and exactly what she then resented me for being. I had confused being humble with being erased. They are not the same thing, and it took a stranger to show me the difference, and I'm going to spend whatever years I have left making sure I never confuse them again. But I didn't know that yet. On the 27th of June, I just knew my wife had told me to keep my mouth shut, and that I had every intention of obeying. So, let me take you to the dinner. The drive there, Diane briefed me like I was a child going to a job interview. Don't bring up politics, don't bring up religion, don't correct anybody. If someone asks what you did, just say you worked for the county and leave it there. These are not, Harlan, these are not our kind of people. These are a step up, and Trevor has a real chance here, and I will not have you ruining it by getting on one of your topics. She looked over at me at a red light. Can you do that? For me? For one night? And I said, I can do that. And I meant it. Understand, I wasn't sitting there plotting a reveal. I had no idea who Vivian's father was. Diane had said a judge, but there are a lot of judges, and I'd been retired 8 years, and I assumed it was some local fellow I'd never crossed paths with. I was fully prepared to spend the whole evening as furniture. I'd made my peace with furniture years ago. The house was exactly what you're picturing. New money, doing an impression of old money, everything a little too polished, a little too matched, a chandelier that cost more than a nurse makes in a year. Vivian's people were in construction and development, and they had the particular confidence of people who have never once in their lives been the least important person in a room and cannot imagine what that would even feel like. They were perfectly polite to me, in the way that is worse than rude. A young man took my coat and priced my jacket with his eyes in the same motion. Vivian's mother shook my hand and was already looking over my shoulder for someone better before our hands had finished meeting. When Diane introduced me, my husband, Harlan, he's retired, I watched the information land and get filed under no one, and the person's face do the small polite reset toward the next, more useful human being. I know that look. God, do I know that look. I spent 33 years watching powerful people give it to the poor, the accused, the unimportant. I'd spent 33 years making sure that in my courtroom at least, the look bought you nothing, that the man in the cheap suit got the exact same gravity and patience from me as the man who owned the building. And here I was on the receiving end of it in a foyer, 72 years old, being filed under no one, and do you know what I did? I let them. I got myself a glass of water from the man behind the bar. I thanked him by name, Andre, because I'd heard someone else use it, and he looked at me a little startled, the way service people look when a guest sees them. And I went and I found my chair by the wall, and I sat down in it, and I kept my mouth shut. And I watched Vivian's father hold court. I want to describe him to you the way I saw him that night before I knew, because the not knowing is important. He was about my age, maybe a few years younger. Silver hair, beautifully cut, a good dark suit. And he had the thing, you know the thing, the ease of a man who has been the most important person in the room so many times that he no longer has to try, he simply is, and the room agrees. He moved through those 30 people like a current, and they turned toward him like they were rooted, and he was the light. And I'll be honest, I felt the old tired disapproval I'd fought my whole career. Because I've met that man 1,000 times, the one who's learned to wear his importance like cologne, and I've watched what that kind of certainty does to a person's judgment, and I sat there and I thought uncharitably, there's a man who's never doubted himself a day in his life. I was wrong about him, that's the first thing you should know. I was doing to him exactly what the room was doing to me. I was reading the surface and filing him. I'd forgotten my own first rule, the one I'd made rooms full of lawyers recite back to me. You do not know a person until you know what it costs them to become what they are. The toast started around 9. Someone tapped a glass. Vivian's father rose, and the room hushed for him instantly, the way it never once hushed for anyone else all night, and he began to speak. And he was good. Warm, funny, unhurried. He toasted Vivian, his daughter, and there was real love in it. And I softened a little, because a man who loves his daughter like that has at least one thing right. He toasted Trevor, my wife's brother, generously, welcoming him to the family. And as he talked, he did the thing that powerful men do. He began to move, drifting slowly along the length of that long table, stopping to rest a hand on a shoulder, to include a face, to make each person feel chosen for a moment. He was maybe 15 feet from me. I was still just watching. I had absolutely no idea. He was working his way down the table toward the wall where I sat, and I remember thinking, mildly, he'll skip me, the way everyone had skipped me all night, and I was fine with it. I'd have preferred it. He reached the end of that long table and rounded it, and he saw my face. And I watched a thing happen to a powerful man that I have only seen a handful of times in my life. I watched him come completely apart and put himself back together in about 4 seconds, in front of everyone, without moving a muscle below the neck. Because Judge Nathaniel Cross was looking at the old man in the chair by the wall, the retired nobody, the husband they'd filed under no one. And Judge Nathaniel Cross was 28 years old again, and terrified, and standing at a podium in my courtroom with his whole life about to break. Now, I have to take you back to 1990. Because none of what happened in that dining room makes sense without it, and it's the heart of the whole thing. In 1990, I was 36 years old and 5 years onto the trial bench. Young for it, still finding out what kind of judge I was going to be. And onto my docket came a case that I've thought about every year of my life since. A case that made me the way it made him. I'll change the details that need changing, but the shape is true. There was a family in this state, I'll call them the Vandermeers, which isn't the name, who owned construction and development and, through it, owned a great deal else, including, it was widely understood, several people who should not have been ownable. Judges. A prosecutor or two. The Vandermeers were the kind of powerful where the power was quiet and total and never had to be spoken. And a young man had been hurt. Badly, permanently, on a Vandermeer job site, because the Vandermeers had cut a corner that they had been formally warned about and had chosen, on paper, to ignore, because fixing it cost money and a workman's spine did not. And this young man, who had nothing, who was nobody, sued them. No firm in the city would take it. You did not sue the Vandermeers. It was a way to end your career. It landed, finally, with a young lawyer barely 2 years out of school, working alone out of a rented room, first generation, the son of immigrants who'd cleaned other people's buildings so he could go to law school. He took it because no one else would, and because the injured man deserved someone, and everyone, including him, understood he was going to lose, because that was simply how the world was, arranged. That young lawyer was Nathaniel Cross. I watched them try to break him for months, in my courtroom and out of it. The Vandermeers had 6 lawyers from the best firm in the state, and they buried him in paper, and they moved to dismiss on every conceivable ground, and they made it known, in the 1,000 quiet ways that power makes things known, that this case was to go away, and that everyone sensible understood that. And I felt the pressure too. I want to be honest about that because the young lawyer wasn't the only one being leaned on. I got the calls, not crude ones, powerful people are never crude, but a lunch here, a word from a senior colleague there, a mention that I was young and had a long career ahead of me, and that certain cases were not the hill a promising judge died on. The message, underneath, was unmistakable. Rule the sensible way, make this go away, and doors will stay open for you. Rule the other way, and find out what happens to judges who don't understand how things work. I was 36, I had a whole career in front of me, and I sat in my chambers one night and I understood, with total clarity, that this was the case where I found out who I actually was. Here is what happened. And it's less dramatic than you'd think, because real courage usually is. It isn't a speech. It's a man doing his job on a day when doing his job costs him something. I denied their motions, all of them. Not out of sympathy for the injured man. A judge who rules from sympathy is as dangerous as one who rules from pressure, but because the law and the facts required it, and I had decided that the law and the facts were going to be the only 2 things that got a vote in my courtroom, and that the Vandermeers' quiet ownership of half the state was going to buy them, in that one room, exactly nothing. But the moment that matters, the one Nathaniel carried for 36 years, wasn't a ruling. It was smaller. There was a day, deep in the trial, when the Vandermeers' lead lawyer did the thing that works, the thing that had worked on this young man his whole life. He treated Nathaniel like he was nobody. Openly, contemptuously. He made a remark on the record about counsel's inexperience and his obvious unfamiliarity with how these matters are properly handled, and he did it with a little smile to the gallery, and I watched that young lawyer, alone, exhausted, outgunned 6-1, carrying the entire weight of a broken man's life on his 2 years' experience shoulders. I watched him start to fold. I watched him believe it. I watched him shrink at that podium into the nobody they'd all decided he was. And I stopped the proceedings. I said, on the record, in front of the 6 expensive lawyers in the gallery and everyone, counsel will refrain from characterizing Mr. Cross. Mr. Cross is the only attorney in this courtroom representing the party who was actually harmed, and he is doing so competently and alone against considerable resources, and this court has noted it. We will confine ourselves to the merits. That's all. That's the whole heroic moment. A judge telling a bully to sit down, and telling a frightened young man in front of the people trying to erase him that he was seen and that he was not nobody. I found out years later that Nathaniel went back to his rented room that night and wrote down what I'd said, word for word, and kept it. He told me he read it before every hard thing he ever did afterward. He won the case. The injured man was provided for life, and the Vandermeers, who had never lost anything, lost in my courtroom, because a young nobody wouldn't quit and a young judge wouldn't be bought. And it cost me, I'll be honest about that too. I was passed over for elevation twice in the years after, and I knew exactly why, and I made my peace with it. And it was 15 years before I made it to the Supreme Court, longer than it should have taken, and every one of those years was worth it, because I had found out who I was, and the answer was, a man who would not keep his mouth shut when it mattered. That's who was sitting in the chair by the wall. The judge just hadn't looked closely enough yet. Neither, for 7 years, had my wife. There's one more piece of it, and it's the piece that makes the word really in his question land the way it did. After that case, I didn't adopt Nathaniel Cross or mentor him in any formal way. That's not how it worked. But I watched him. Over the years, from the bench, I watched that young lawyer become a very good one, and then a great one, always for the people no one else would take, and when he was finally, years later, considered for a judgeship himself, I was asked, quietly, the way these things are asked, what I thought of him. And I told them the truth. I told them he was the finest lawyer of his generation that I had seen, that he had more integrity in him than any 3 men I could name, and that if this state had any sense it would put him on the bench and keep him there. I wrote it down, and I signed my name to it, and by then my name meant something, and it helped. It wasn't the only thing. He'd earned it 10 times over on his own. But when a man is deciding whether to believe in himself enough to reach for a thing, sometimes what tips him is knowing that someone he respects already believes it. I got to be that for him, twice in one lifetime. We hadn't spoken in probably 15 years. Our paths ran parallel but rarely crossed, different courts, different worlds, and then I retired, and then Miriam died, and I fell out of that world entirely, and I suppose to everyone still in it I simply vanished, the way the retired do. An old Chief Justice, gone quiet, gone plain, married a nice anxious woman and disappeared into a garage with his chisels. So when Nathaniel Cross came around the end of that table and found me sitting in the chair by the wall, filed under no one, dressed in my one good jacket, having been introduced all night as my husband, he's retired, he was not just surprised to see an old colleague. He was surprised, I understood later, to see the man who had defended him when he was nobody, being treated as nobody, in his own family's home, and saying nothing, and letting it happen. And that, I think, is what actually stopped the toast. Not the reunion, the wrongness of it. Nathaniel Cross had spent 36 years reading a sentence off a scrap of paper that told him he was not nobody. And he looked up from his own daughter's engagement dinner and saw the man who wrote that sentence being made into nobody, 10 feet away, and something in him simply would not allow the evening to proceed as if that were acceptable. So he stopped, and his smile went out, and he said, "Hello. I'm very surprised to see you here." And then he looked around at all of them, at my wife gone pale, at the people who'd filed me under no one, and he asked them if they knew who I really was. And into that dead silent room, before anyone could answer, he answered it himself. He turned to the room, and he did not raise his voice. I noticed that. The old craftsman in me noticed it, that he'd learned somewhere that the quietest voice in a silent room is the loudest thing there is, and he said, "Most of you don't know him, so let me introduce him properly, because I don't think I'll get another chance to do it in front of this many people." He gestured at me with his glass. My wife had one hand at her throat. "This is Harlan Reeves. 36 years ago, when I was a broke, terrified, 2 years out of school lawyer that nobody in this city would hire, I took a case I was told would end my career. I took it against people a great deal like, well..." He smiled, a little grimly, and let that hang, and half the construction money in the room shifted in its seats. Against people who were used to winning without having to try, and I was losing. Not because I was wrong, but because I was nobody, and everybody in that courtroom, including me, had agreed that nobody loses to somebody. He looked at me, and the judge on that case would not accept it. He would not let them treat me as nobody, and he would not let them buy an outcome, and he ruled on the law when ruling on the law cost him his own career for 15 years. I know it did, Your Honor. I found out later. I know exactly what that case cost you, and you never once mentioned it to me. I hadn't known he knew that. I looked at the floor. That man, Nathaniel said, went on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of this state. He is the most respected jurist this state has produced in my lifetime. Lawyers study his opinions in school. I have read them to my own law clerks. When people ask me why I became the kind of judge I became, the honest answer, the whole answer, is a sentence this man said out loud in a courtroom in 1990 when I had decided I was worthless, and I have carried it in my wallet for 36 years. And he reached into his jacket, this distinguished silver-haired judge, in front of 30 people at his daughter's engagement party, and he took out his wallet, and out of it a piece of paper so old and so folded it had gone soft as cloth, and he unfolded it with real care, and he read it out loud, and it was what I'd said. About Mr. Cross being the only lawyer in the room representing the party who was harmed. About him not being nobody. His voice did not stay entirely steady on it. Neither, I'll tell you, did mine, and I hadn't said a word. Then he folded it back up, and he put it away, and he looked at the room full of people who had spent the evening looking through me, and he said simply, "So, when I ask if you know who he really is, that's who he is, and I would like to know why the most honorable man I've ever stood in front of is sitting in a chair by the wall. I want to tell you what a room looks like when it has to reassemble everything it decided about a person, all at once, in public. It is not satisfying the way you'd think. That's the honest thing. I had, I will admit, imagined a moment like this in some small bitter corner of myself over 7 years, the moment they all find out, and I had assumed it would feel like triumph. It did not feel like triumph. It felt strange, and a little sad, and mostly I was aware of one face in that room, and it was not any of theirs. It was Diane's, because everyone else in that room was rearranging a stranger, but my wife was rearranging her husband. Everyone else was learning who the old man in the chair was. Diane was learning who she had been ashamed of for 7 years, at dinner after dinner. Everyone else got to feel a pleasant social embarrassment and then a rush to correct it. Diane had to stand there and understand that the man she had told, that very afternoon at 3:40, to keep his mouth shut so he wouldn't embarrass her, was a man whose refusal to keep his mouth shut 36 years ago was being read aloud from a wallet by the most important man she had ever tried to impress, as the finest thing anyone in the room had ever witnessed. I watched it land on her. I've watched a great many faces receive hard news. It's a large part of what a judge does. And I'll give Diane her due here, because this is the moment she could have become smaller and she didn't, and it's the reason I'm still married to her, so I'll tell it true. She did not do the thing a certain kind of person does, which is to rush across the room and start performing pride, start telling everyone, yes, of course, my husband, the Chief Justice, start retroactively claiming a man she'd spent the evening steering toward the wall. She could have. It would have been easy, and it would have been disgusting, and I'd have known. She didn't. She just stood there, with her hand at her throat, and she looked at me across that room, and her eyes filled, and what was in her face was not social calculation. It was shame. Real shame, the useful kind, the kind that means a person is actually seeing themselves for a moment. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've wronged when you've just understood the size of it. And then Vivian's father, Nathaniel, was crossing the room to me, and 30 people were standing, actually standing, the way a courtroom stands, though none of them could have told you why they'd risen. And he took my hand in both of his, and he said quietly, just to me, "Your Honor, my God, it's good to see you." And his eyes were wet, and I stood up out of the chair by the wall, finally, and I shook the hand of the frightened young man I'd defended 36 years ago, now 64 and silver-haired and holding a room, and I said the first full sentence I'd spoken all night. I said, "Hello, Nathaniel. You did well. I always knew you would." There was a moment, a little later that night, that I haven't been able to stop turning over. Nathaniel got me alone for a minute, away from the table, out on a back terrace where it was quiet, and he was different out there. Not the judge holding a room, just a 64-year-old man talking to the person who'd changed his life. And he said, "Can I tell you something I never told you?" And he told me that the night of that ruling in 1990, he had already written his letter of resignation from the law. It was in his coat pocket in the courtroom. He'd decided he wasn't strong enough for it, that the world was simply built for the Vandermeers and against people like him and his father, and that he was going to quit and do something else, something safer, something that didn't ask him to stand alone at a podium and lose to power over and over for the rest of his life. And then I said the thing about him from the bench, that he was not nobody, that the court had noted it. And he went back to his rented room that night and he took the resignation letter out of his pocket and he tore it up. "You didn't just help me win a case, Your Honor. he said on that terrace, and his voice wasn't steady. You are the reason I didn't quit the law entirely at 28. Everything I've done in 36 years, every person I helped, my whole career, my daughter's whole life, this house, this party, all of it is downstream of you deciding on one Tuesday not to let them erase me. And you never knew. You said one sentence and went home and probably forgot it by dinner, and it built my entire life. I hadn't known. I need you to understand, I genuinely hadn't known. To me, it had been a small thing, a routine thing, a judge doing his job, and it had been the hinge his whole life turned on. That's the thing about saying the true thing out loud. You almost never find out what it does. It goes out of you and into someone and builds something you'll never see. I only found out because his daughter happened to marry my wife's brother, and I happened to be sitting in a chair by a wall. There are, I promise you, other sentences I said across 33 years that did the same thing, and I'll die never knowing which ones. So will you. That's not a reason to stay quiet. It's the whole reason to speak. The rest of that dinner was a strange and total inversion. And I'll tell you about it briefly because it taught me something about people that I already knew but had let myself forget. Suddenly, I was somebody. Vivian's father sat me at his right hand for the remainder of the meal and displaced someone important to do it. And the whole current of the room that had flowed around him all evening now flowed around the two of us. The people who had filed me under no one were now, urgently, warmly, my new best friends. Vivian's mother, who had looked over my shoulder while shaking my hand, now could not do enough for me, refilled my water herself, laughed at things I hadn't intended as jokes. The young man who'd priced my jacket brought me a coffee unbidden. Trevor, my wife's brother, kept catching my eye with a stunned, delighted look, mouthing, "You never said anything." And I want to be clear about how that felt, because it's the lesson, and it isn't the flattering one. It felt hollow, because none of those people had changed. They were treating me completely differently, but not one of them had become a better person in the last 10 minutes. They had simply received new information about my rank and adjusted. The exact same faculty that had let them look through me at the door was now, unchanged, aimed the other direction. I was being valued for precisely the wrong reason, for the title, the rank, the thing I'd spent my whole life refusing to trade on, by people who, 10 minutes earlier, valued me at nothing for lack of it. The only two people in that room whose regard meant anything to me were the only two who hadn't changed at all. Nathaniel, who had honored me before he had any social reason to, when I was still just the old man by the wall, who honored me, in fact, precisely because I was being treated as nobody, not despite it. And Diane, whose face, alone in that whole glittering room, showed not recalculation, but grief. Everyone else just repriced the asset. I'd spent 33 years watching people do exactly that, and here it was one more time, in a beautiful dining room, performed for my benefit, and it was as ugly up close as it had ever looked from the bench. I was gracious. I want to say that. I did not spend the evening being cold to people to punish them for the door. That's not who 33 years made me. I talked with them, and I let Nathaniel tell his stories, and I answered the sudden flood of questions about cases and the court with as much patience as I had, and it was, in its way, a lovely evening, the loveliest I'd had in years, because after 7 years of silence I was allowed to be the whole of myself at a dinner table out loud, and nobody shushed me. But the thing I kept, the thing I drove home with, was not the deference. It was Diane's face, because that was the only thing in the room that was real, and it was the thing I was going to have to talk to my wife about, and I did not yet know what I was going to say. We drove home in silence for a long time. Not the comfortable kind. She was waiting for me to say something, and I think she was braced for it to be cruel, because she knew, she is not a stupid woman, Diane, she's a frightened one, there's a difference. She knew that I had every card now, and that a lesser man, or an angrier one, would play them. I didn't play them. But I didn't let her off either, and I want to tell you exactly what I said, because getting the balance of it right is the whole point, and it took me 33 years on a bench to learn how. About halfway home, she finally broke and said, in a small voice, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" And there was an accusation buried in it, a little one, as if this were somehow my fault for hiding it. And I pulled the car over, onto the shoulder, and I put it in park, and I turned to face my wife, and for the first time in 7 years I used the voice, not loud, I never needed loud, the voice I used when a courtroom needed to understand that the next thing said mattered. I said, "Diane, I did tell you. I told you the first year, at the Hendersons' dinner, when I mentioned I'd spent my life on the bench and you told the table I was boring and changed the subject. I told you every time you shushed me. I have been telling you who I am for 7 years. You didn't want to know. It was more comfortable for you to have a husband you could be a little ashamed of than a husband you'd have to feel small next to. So you decided I was the embarrassing old man in the chair because that was easier than finding out I might be something you'd have to live up to." She started to cry, and I did not stop, but I softened, because the point was never to win. I said, "I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because I did something wrong too, and mine was worse because I knew better. I let you do it. I have sat quiet in 100 chairs by 100 walls because keeping the peace with you felt easier than being fully myself. And that's not humility, Diane. I told myself it was humility for 7 years, and it was cowardice. I spent my whole life refusing to keep my mouth shut for powerful men, and then I kept it shut for you, over and over, to avoid a hard conversation in a car. So we did this together. You made me small, and I agreed to it, and I'm done agreeing to it." She asked me, through the crying, if I was leaving her, and I said no. And I meant it. I said, "I'm 72 years old, and I loved my first wife for 38 years, and I don't have it in me to start over, and I don't want to, and underneath all this I do love you. But something has to change, and it isn't going to be me getting quieter. From now on, when we go somewhere, I am going to be the whole of who I am. I am going to have opinions and say them. I am going to talk to the person parking the cars like he's my equal because he is, and you are going to have to decide whether you can be married to a man you're proud of, which turns out to be harder for you than being married to one you're ashamed of, and I am truly sorry that it's harder, and I am not going to protect you from it anymore." That was 2 weeks ago. I'll tell you where things stand, because I won't lie to you and wrap it in a bow. Diane and I are still married, and we are in the hardest, most honest stretch of our marriage, and I'm not sure, but I think it might be the beginning of a real one. She has been quiet in a new way since that night, not the sulking kind, the thinking kind. 2 days after, she said something to me at breakfast that I didn't expect. She said, "I've been ashamed of the wrong things my whole life." And then she couldn't say any more, and neither of us pushed it. But a woman who can say that sentence out loud at 65 is a woman who might actually change, and I've decided to find out. Because people can, I've seen them do it. Usually late and usually the hard way, which is the only way it's real. Nathaniel and I have had lunch twice. We're going to keep doing it. 36 years, I let that friendship lapse out of some misplaced idea that the retired should disappear, and it took his daughter marrying my wife's brother to hand it back to me, and I'm not going to waste it. He still has the paper in his wallet. He showed me again at lunch, and I told him it was the most humbling thing I've ever seen, and he said, "Your Honor, you have no idea what it did for me, that day, to be seen." And I did know. I knew exactly. Because 2 weeks ago, at 72, in a chair by a wall, I found out all over again what it does to a person to be seen when he'd started to believe he was nobody. So here's what I want to leave you with, and then I'll let you go. I spent 7 years confusing two things that are not the same, and it nearly cost me myself, and I don't want it to cost you yours. Being humble means you don't need everyone to know how important you are. That's a good thing. Keep that. But being erased means you let people decide you're nothing, and you go along with it, and you swallow the truest, best part of yourself to keep somebody else comfortable. That is not humility. I called it humility for 7 years because that word let me off the hook. It was fear. It was the easier thing. There is a difference between not needing to be seen and agreeing to be invisible. And a whole lot of good people, quiet, decent, humble people, the best people, the ones who'd never dream of bragging, cross from the first one into the second one so slowly they never notice, until one day they're sitting in a chair by a wall at their own life, keeping their mouth shut, because somebody told them to a long time ago, and they just never stopped. Don't keep your mouth shut. Not about the true things. Not to make a frightened person comfortable, and not because you've decided your voice stopped mattering when you got old, or got quiet, or lost the person who used to want to hear it. Somebody in that room tonight needed to hear the true thing said out loud. In every room, somebody does. And you might be the only person there who has it in you to say it. So here's my question, and I rate everyone. When did you last make yourself smaller to keep somebody comfortable? And what was the true thing you swallowed to do it? You don't have to name the person. Just tell me the thing you didn't say. Say it here if you can't say it there yet. Because a man spent 36 years carrying one sentence in his wallet that someone said out loud when it counted, and it built his whole life, and you never know which sentence, said out loud, is going to be somebody's. And if this reached you, if you've been sitting in the chair by the wall, then subscribe and come sit closer. I'll be here. I make these for the people who went quiet and are starting to remember they have a voice. My wife told me to keep my mouth shut so I wouldn't embarrass her. The most respected man in that room stood up and told everyone that not keeping my mouth shut was the finest thing I ever did. Both of those were about the same voice. I'm going to go on using it now.